now. So you obviously know that I'm not in class today. I'm at the sport photos. So essentially what I want you to do is listen through and follow through this video. There's going to be a couple of slides and a bit of information I'm going to go through in regards to the module. Specifically the connections between the texts, what type of question they're going to ask you in the exam, and obviously how we can put together some ideas and arguments or theses in regards to those questions. So the whole point of this is that we're going to go through this generically, and then in the next couple of lessons when I do have you, we'll start analysing Pacino, and then we can put together a response. But it's always good to have some sort of idea of what you want to argue, and then we're going to go through that. Okay, so Module A, comparative study of texts and contexts, so the examination rubric. So in your trial and in your HSC, you have the topic, and in that you have this examination rubric. So it's always good to read over it just before you start your exam, just so then it reminds you what the examiner is looking for. Now, the reason why they're there is obviously because they're going to mark to this, so it'll be silly not to take into consideration these 3 points. So it says, demonstrate understanding of meanings of a pair of texts when considered together. So that means that we need to talk about Richard and looking for Richard simultaneously. We can't focus too much on Richard, nor can we focus too much on looking for Richard. We need to be able to talk about them in unison and integrate them in our responses. We also need to show that we can see a connection between the two. We can look at the meaning of Pacino and what is the reason why he's making this film, and why is he taking on the challenge of showing Richard III to a modern day mass. And then we're also looking at Shakespeare's Richard, and why is he showing this? Is it to promote the Tudor myth? Is it just purely entertainment? We need to know both their meanings, and then we have to look at what, if we put them together, how do they work together? How do they reflect each other's context? Or in particular, looking for Richard, what is it that makes him want to tackle this idea? And what aspects of Richard III is he using, is he changing, or is he focusing on, given his context? The next part, it says evaluate the relationship between texts and contexts. That kind of links from the first one, in the sense that we need to see the connection between the two. And obviously if we evaluate something, we need to see, well, is it done successfully? So for example, if we look at looking for Richard and his characterization and justification of his portrayal of Richard, is it successful? Is it something that is effective in terms of, conveying the idea of Machiavellian politics? Or it could be something like, does he pay close attention to the deformity? Is it an integral aspect of Richard's characterization? And is he effective in conveying it to the audience? Is he effective in showing the essence of Richard, as in Shakespeare's play? Or does he completely manipulate it and stuff it up, and then we can't actually tell that this is a Elizabethan play in the first place? So we really need to make that judgment, and by making a judgment or evaluating something, we need to have some sort of argument. And so that is the starting point. We need to figure out what we're going to argue, and then in that argument, we evaluate what's being conveyed in the texts. A third one, organize, develop, and express ideas using language appropriate to audience, purpose, and form. Essentially, being able to write in an essay format, using a clear structure, writing with sophistication. So we're looking at complex sentences, we're looking at a sustained argument, an argument that is threefold. It's not just singular, so there's three things that we're arguing, and it's building up, and it leads to a logical and sequential conclusion, and that's through the evaluation. And then at the bottom of the slide it says the question will focus on an aspect of the text or links between them. You need to find the connections between the texts, and that's what we're going to look at now. In the next slide we're going to look at, well, what is it that connects Richard III and looking for Richard? Okay, so the best way to do this is to implement this strategy. It's called a Venn diagram, and essentially it allows you guys to put the ideas on a piece of paper, visualize the differences, and then find the similarities. And by doing that, we can find the connections between the two texts, which is the thing that says at the bottom of the slide, you need to find connections between the texts. So the way that this is structured is very simple. Two circles. One side we write Shakespeare's Richard, so all the things that we think of when we look at Shakespeare's Richard or portrayal of Richard, and then we do the same thing for Pacino's Richard, which is in the film. Now, it's important to note that in regards to Al Pacino's Richard, we're looking at his reflections, but also looking at his actual portrayal in those little scenes and those little snippets that we see throughout the docudrama or documentary, whatever you want to call it. So we're actually analysing two things. We're analysing the interview aspects, and then we're analysing the actual performance that he gives, which becomes a little bit confusing, but hopefully when we do look at that in my example, it will make more sense. So the reason why a Venn diagram works is that then when we put the two differences side by side, in the middle we can put things that both those composers are trying to achieve. And in that way, when we are structuring our essay or structuring some sort of paragraph or response, we can see how we would put it together. Obviously, we talk about the differences first, and then we look at the similarities, and then we evaluate the effectiveness of the composers, or for example, Richard, in trying to convey Shakespeare's idea, or vice versa. How does Shakespeare support Richard's decisions? So by using this type of diagram, it actually helps us, and it also allows you guys to visualize it, which I think is key, because sometimes if we just look at text or we just have tables or we just fill in the pages with notes, it does become quite daunting, so this helps. So an example would be, so what I've done in here is we've looked at just one particular aspect, so this is one example. So for Shakespeare's Richard, I've said that, in terms of Richard's characterization, Richard is the embodiment of the vice or the negative characteristics of humankind, a development of the villain in Renaissance theatre, and so that's relevant to the Elizabethan context. So during that point in time, when they were conveying different types of characters, the vice are basically the certain characteristics of humankind that are negative. So it could be, gambling, or someone who likes to gossip, or someone who is like manipulative, and all those different negative attributes of humankind. And so Richard here, Shakespeare here, when he portrays Richard, says that he is the vice. So he is basically the embodiment of the negative characteristics of humankind. Now, for the audience, they would know exactly what he's talking about, because it was a common thing that was happening in that period of time and in theatre at that period of time. Whereas for us, it's quite different. We don't really know what the vice is unless we look it up on Wikipedia or Google. So for the audience themselves, for his context, it makes sense. And so what you do in it is basically you put your little point in, and then underneath that you have a quote or some sort of analysis to support it. So then you're already building those blocks for some sort of response. So obviously we get this from Act 3, Scene 1. Thus, like the formal vice iniquity, I moralize two meanings with one word. So we've got 1 point on Shakespeare's Richard. If we go to the right, we look at Pacino's Richard. I basically wrote, in his attempts to convey Richard's villainy to the audience, Pacino does not rely solely on his deformity to relate to his audience. Pacino's costuming of Richard, all black clothing, and having him lurk in shadows allows the audience to understand him to be evil rather than sympathize with his disability. So obviously with Pacino's Richard, because it's in a 21st century context, there are a lot of different things that influence his people, which is different to the Elizabethans. Obviously the deformity thing comes up. Now back then, and I've said this in class before, Elizabethans, if you see someone who's deformed, you kind of think that they're evil, they're born evil, they've done something wrong, or their parents have done something wrong to warrant that deformity. For us and our context, we don't see that now. We understand through genetic research and all those different things that there is no reason there is no supernatural reason as to why someone becomes deformed. So automatically, when we're looking at the film, we're not thinking that Richard's a bad person because he's deformed, and Pacino identifies that. So I look at the little scenes that are within the movie. So when he's actually portraying Richard as a character. And we see that he's in all black clothing and he's lurking in the shadows, he's hiding. That tells us as an audience that he's shifty. That tells us that he's manipulative and evil. So even though he's deformed is part of his characterization, it's what Pacino adds to it that makes him evil. And so all of a sudden we see the two differences, where both of these examples appeal to their relevant contexts, hence why they're on the outside in the differences part of the Venn diagram. And in the middle, I have, so both composers aim to convey the villainous nature of Richard through the exploration of the opening soliloquy, Shakespeare through language and Al Pacino through film. Now that's a similarity because both of these composers focus on the soliloquy, and specifically Pacino, he really tries to recreate what Shakespeare is trying to do. He doesn't change words, he doesn't add different things to it. Basically, he gets the soliloquy and he recites it. He just reads it out from the in the beginning of the docudrama. So there's a similarity and there's a friction point where we can argue, where we can look at, well, these are the two things on the outside of the Venn diagram which look at his characterization, but in essence they're still trying to do the same thing. They're still trying to appeal to the audience's understanding of villainy, of being evil. They've done it in a roundabout way and relevant to their context, but they're still looking at that similar idea. And see if that makes sense in terms of this Venn diagram. Now, if it doesn't, rewind and have a look at it again. If not, then I don't know, go home or stop listening. I don't know, but it should work. So what I want you guys to do now is if I'm going to go to the next slide, you're going to create your own Venn diagram. So I'm going to give you about 20 minutes. So you create your own Venn diagram. On each slide, or each side, list Richard's qualities and include quotations and notes about techniques to support your ideas. In the center, note the similarities between the way the two texts represent Richard. Obviously, you got to do 3 to 4 examples because you're going to have 3 to 4 paragraphs. By doing this, you're creating those foundation points. So when you do start writing a response, it will work. And this is also how we will create some sort of thesis. So without further ado, this video is going to be playing for 20 minutes. So you can actually time yourself so you can stay on track. So don't get distracted and work through it. And I'll provide some nice jazz music for 20 minutes. And then you'll hear my voice again. welcome back. Hopefully you completed the task. If you haven't, obviously it's for homework. It's vital that you do because it does help you put together your idea, your thesis, and your arguments. So what I'm going to cover now is very quickly and generally this idea of thesis and arguments and what we can argue when approaching this module, and especially the Richard and looking for Richard essay. Now, we have to always remember that for this module, we have to look at both texts. Shakespeare's Richard III and Al Pacino's Looking for Richard. If you don't do that, you're not going to get a good mark. You need to be able to talk about both. So what I've done is I've just went online and I found a couple of past arguments or theses that people used, and we're going to look at what makes them good and what do they all have in common. And hopefully, when you start putting your idea or your argument together, you can do the same things. So then when you do start writing your essay and adding your arguments and your analysis and your evaluation and all those things, you have a clear line of argument and a clear direction. So, or one direction. So if we move on now, some examples. So these are just from online. So Looking for Richard connects the audience to Shakespeare through the exploration of the enigmatic Richard III. Both Richard III and Looking for Richard are products of different times, yet they are connected through the exploration of what is to be human. Looking for Richard reconnects us with Shakespeare's characters and themes, reminding us that they are timeless. We can look for Richard and find him in the world around us. Pacino's Looking for Richard demonstrates how the reshaping of an original text, such as the tragedy of King Richard III, is influenced by the purpose, values, and context of the composer. Now, they're all very good arguments or theses, and they all have something in common. And what we're going to do now is break it down. So then I know it just looks like a bunch of words on a slide, but hopefully once I show you what they're doing, it makes sense. So the first thing I want you to look at is that all these different arguments have some sort of reference to connection. So that's in the red. So Looking for Richard connects the audience, connected to their exploration, reconnects. Reshaping is kind of like a synonym for the connection, reconnecting. So we know that that's what we need to focus our arguments on. What connects, or what is the connection between Looking for Richard and Richard III? Why are we studying these two texts? Why aren't we doing two random texts? What is it about these two that make them compatible? Okay, because that's essentially what it is. Connection, reconnection. It's what makes this work. And all these different ideas have all these different arguments do that. The first one is very simple. Okay, connects the audience to Shakespeare. Okay, and we can see that through Al Pacino talking about what makes Richard so good, or what makes it so hard for an American to convey it. The second argument there, it's looking at what it means to be human. And so essentially, we know as a marker or as someone just reading an essay that that is your main point. So then if we continue through, the next thing that they all have in common is that they talk about context. The first one looks at the audience. Obviously, that means we talk about Elizabethan and modern audience. Products of different times. It's just another rewording of context. Reminding us that are timeless. So if it's timeless, that means it's applicable to both the Elizabethan and the 21st century context. Okay, and even in the last question, it's straight out of the last argument, straight out of the rubric, purpose, values, and context of the composer. So again, there's that commonality between all four: connection, and obviously that connection with the audience. So we're looking at that relationship between the two. And one of the things in the rubric, and was in your last assessment task, is that interplay between these things, this relationship between those things. So already these arguments are looking at specifically what connects the audience, what is the relationship between the context and the texts. Okay, so if we've looked at context and text, obviously now we need something that brings it all together, and this is what the next slide looks at, and it's basically central ideas. So in the first one, we're looking at Richard himself, Richard III. And so essentially your whole essay is going to be focused on Richard and on what the different composers do with the character. The second thesis looks at what it means to be human, so it's a theme, and you can talk about manipulation, or you can talk about device. You can talk about all those different things. And the third one, we can look for Richard around him and find him in the world around us. So essentially, how it's applicable to this audience. So essentially, the stuff in green, they can be manipulated and changed. As long as you're looking at the connection and you're looking at the context, you can talk about anything else on how that is shown. You can choose character, you can choose themes, you can choose ideas, as long as you do the first two. And do the three things, the interplay between those three things. If you can evaluate that effectively in your essay, you're well on your way in getting a good mark. Okay, so if we just quickly summarize that, so all these arguments look at the idea of connections, therefore you need to do it. There's reference to context, and there's some sort of central idea. All three of those things have to be evident in your introduction and obviously in your argument. You don't have these things, then when it comes to evaluating, it's going to be very hard. And so when you start choosing your textual evidence and writing your paragraphs, these three ideas need to be at the forefront of your mind. Okay, so for the remainder of this lesson, you're going to do these activities. So I want you to come up with 3 of your own arguments using that format. Okay, you can go back and look at it, or actually I'll put it at the end of this slide anyway, these examples, and you have to try and create 3 of your own. And then of those 3, just post one of them into the Google Classroom. I'll just put up an announcement and you just comment and put in your thesis. It just shows me that you are on the right track and you're trying to figure out and come up with your own idea. They don't have to be like great, and they don't have to reinvent the wheel. If it's essentially you just changing some of the words in that, then that's fine, as long as you get used to thinking about that. The other thing I want you to do is to read and summarize the Neil Signet article that I've posted with this video. It's a really good article, and it really shows someone trying to argue the idea of what Pacino's trying to do. And I'm going to make a lot of reference to that article on Monday's lesson, so if you haven't done it, you're going to be behind. And this is all about you motivating yourselves and trying to be prepared when we do start going this way, because we have probably about a week left on this topic, and I don't want to waste time going through these articles and re-explaining things. So I am going to work on the assumption on Monday that you have finished reading and summarizing that article. You can choose one of the 2 activities to do for the rest of the lesson. That's up to you, as long as both of them are done by Monday. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, obviously you can email me on the weekend, and you can also find me on Twitter or subscribe to the channel. Just joking. Just make sure it's all done. Thank you.
single day. So I want to close my final White House Correspondents' Dinner by just saying thank you. I'm very proud of what you've done. It has been an honor and a privilege to work side by side with you to strengthen our democracy. And with that, I just have two more words to say. Obama out.